Support comes from Soaring Heart Natural Beds, where concern for the health and safety of sleep now extends to everything from curbside pickup and delivery to secure in-store appointments. Showrooms in Seattle, Bellevue, and now in Edmonds, or online at soaringheart.com.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. When state lawmakers show up to the Capitol building in Olympia today, they'll walk past National Guard troops and chain-link fences to get to their first day of work. It's because of an emboldened anti-government movement threatening state capitals around the country. More on that in a minute. First, let's get you caught up. It's the first day of Governor Inslee's new reopening plan, and while a few places, like gyms and the zoo, are getting some slack, for the most part, there's not a lot changing today as far as what you can and can't do. The Department of Health said it will be at least another week before any part of the state moves ahead. The new approach uses a dashboard that measures 8 regions instead of individual counties. King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties are grouped, which means things will have to start looking better in Everett and Tacoma for Seattle to loosen up. A 51-year-old Seattle man is facing federal charges today over last week's short-lived takeover of the U.S. Capitol. Mark J. Leffingwell is charged with entering a restricted building and violent entry and disorderly conduct on Capitol grounds. The complaint against him says he punched a police officer while trying to get in. The Associated Press says there's been no comment from Leffingwell or his lawyer. 2 Seattle police officers are on leave while the agency investigates whether they took part in last Wednesday's riot at the U.S. Capitol. SPD says the investigation began after a colleague saw a photo of the officers that appeared to be from the pro-Trump rally in D.C. Officers are allowed to attend political rallies, but department policy says they can't engage in activities that would undermine public trust, even on their own time. The investigation will determine whether the officers violated SPD policies on professionalism or discretion. And a quick sports note, the Seahawks season is over. They lost to the Los Angeles Rams at Lumen Field on Saturday, even though their quarterback got knocked out of the game early on, and the guy who took over just had thumb surgery on his throwing hand a week and a half ago. 750 National Guard troops surround the state capitol building in Olympia this morning, the first day that state lawmakers will show up in person to start this year's legislative session. Governor Inslee ordered the extra security after a pro-Trump mob overran the U.S. Capitol last week, and a much smaller group of anti-government activists crashed the gate of the governor's mansion here. Seeing armed men storm Capitol buildings on TV is shocking. But my guest, Leah Sottile, says anti-government extremism has been fomenting in the U.S. for decades. And lately, for reasons we'll get into, they're feeling emboldened. Leah is a journalist in Portland. She covers anti-government groups and domestic terrorism for public radio. Leah, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Your reporting takes you all over the U.S., but I'm curious how these ideologies show up here in the Pacific Northwest.
It's got deep roots, that's for sure. This is not that these are born exclusively out of the Northwest, but I think they have taken on a unique flavor in this area of the country. So you'll see a lot of conspiracy theorists sort of attach these conspiracies to whatever political issue is at heart for them. So we've seen a lot of, land rights people who, have some legitimate concerns about how much land the federal government owns and how much people are able to make a living off the land. But then you see them attach it to conspiracy theory. Well, the reason we can't make a living off the land is because of a new world order that's trying to take over our government and things like that. So that has existed in the Northwest for a really, really long time.
Are these fringe ideas becoming more mainstream, or are they just more prominent?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I was still of the mind that this is like a fringe minority that is doing this kind of thing. But I think it is mainstreaming, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Right-wing media, social media, and the dissemination of these ideas. Whereas once, fringe ideas you had to find a poster on a bulletin board at a community center and show up to a meeting to hear those things. Now you can just get on the internet. Like, I'm hearing experts that look at extremism saying, yes, it's one thing when it's on the fringe. Yes, it's one thing when a small group of people goes and takes over a wildlife refuge like they did in 2016 in Oregon. That event, it cannot be understated, the importance of that event, I think, in understanding Wednesday. But now you've got a group of however many people were in Washington, D.C. the other day. That's not exactly just a fringe minority anymore. This is a mass of people being cheered on by the president themselves and being told, go take the Capitol.
So my next question then is, are they organized? What does the network look like, if there is one?
Yeah, I think Wednesday proves that they're organized enough, right? I think that we really saw, especially in the Northwest, a congealing of a lot of these groups around the anti-mask protests. So, that's the big difference that I'm seeing. A few years ago, there was an issue-based thing, land rights or, the wolves. With the anti-mask protests, right-wing extremists saw an open window that, we can bring in all kinds of people who have discontent over their businesses, over their children not being able to go to school. And that's where I think we started to see these things mainstreaming.
The anti-government sentiment and white nationalism seems to go hand in hand here. What role does race play with a lot of these groups having white nationalist roots?
I think it plays a huge role. When Timothy McVeigh bombed the Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1995, he was inspired by the Turner Diaries. It's a piece of neo-Nazi propaganda that calls for the elimination of all races but the white race. People in Washington the other day were repeating lines from the Turner Diaries. They were attacking media, creating nooses out of their microphone cables. This is all a part of this ecosystem. So you cannot separate what we saw the other day from Charlottesville, from the Turner Diaries, from all these things. It's absolutely a motivating factor for it.
It's clear that we can't ignore this movement or dismiss it as just fringe or rhetoric at this point. It's taken a direct, dramatic action in this country. What can we do at this point to address it as a nation?
It's a big question. I think that holding our legislators accountable and not allowing people who foment violence, who support violent rhetoric, who hold white supremacist ideologies, that all has to be stopped at a local level before we see people go up into these high offices. I think as a country, we forgot. I think there's a lot of people in Oklahoma City who would agree with what I'm saying and would say, we really need to look closely at this definition of who is a terrorist and who is not in America.
What is that double standard that we're dealing with here? Because even in the news coverage of the people who were arrested in D.C., there was shock that an MBA who was a CEO of a tech company ended up somehow arrested in the Capitol. Why is that shocking?
I think that it's such a great question. I think that there's this sense of othering in our minds that's gone on, that we think that a Nazi must be burning a cross in hills somewhere far away from where we live. Racism when it happens, it looks like it did in the images we saw out of the civil rights movement in the 60s. That's just crazy to think that way. And I think, if anything, the last 4 years has proven to us in big and small ways that race is the key to this whole issue, that the way everything happened this summer with Black Lives Matter and the way that those protesters were treated, the way we saw, from Snohomish to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and around the Northwest, the streets lined with white men with semi-automatic weapons to protect our cities from these protesters who are simply calling to be treated equally and to, not be abused by the police forces that are supposed to protect them. So I think that's it. I think that at some point, Americans got an idea in their head of what racism was and what it wasn't. And I think right now we need to really think hard about that and about the way this stuff just continues and will continue without nipping it.
Leah Sottile reports on right-wing extremism in the U.S. Great to talk with you. Thanks for your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you want to dig further into this topic, we recommend two podcasts that Leah hosts. 2 Minutes Past 9 is her show about the legacy of the Oklahoma City bombing, and Bundyville tells stories of current extremism in the West, including in the Spokane area. Links to both of those are in the show notes. Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.